Give it up for Augie Lindmark. If you could just talk right into the mic, Augie.
Awesome,
Go ahead.
thanks. Hey, friends. So I just finished singing the first verse of Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land," and then the handcuffs were placed on me. Soon I was surrounded by 30 police officers, and one of them asked a seemingly obvious question: "Do you know you're under arrest?" And I said, "Yes, I do," and smiled and continued to sing. Actually, all of us continued to sing because there were hundreds of us in the United States Capitol Hill Rotunda. In December of 2017, I was breaking the law. Now, 2 months... Hey, thanks. Two months before that, of all the horrible headlines that I read in 2017, one stood out. And it was a New York Times article that said a tax bill had enough votes to pass Congress that would also see 13 million people lose health care in exchange for tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy in this country. Messages started to fill my phone from Facebooks and texts from friends and activists. But if there was a similarity to all these messages, it was one question, and it was this: will you risk arrest in civil disobedience to stop this bill? Now, I am not a rabble-rouser. I am Minnesotan. I am passive-aggressive, which means I bury my anger deep down into my wool socks that say, "You betcha." Both my parents are white Lutheran pastors, which means I get two responses when I tell people that. One is, "Oh, that's why you're so nice." And the second response is, "Oh, I've heard about people like you." I think I fell somewhere in between because rebelliousness was not in the blueprints of my childhood. And for 2 weeks, I called family members and friends and asked them questions of, "Do you think it would be a good idea?" Now, I knew about civil disobedience and the power that it had in social movements of our country, but I had always relegated it to a fine spectrum of more radical activists than I. This was not something for me. Now, at the same time, I was reading Malcolm Gladwell's book, David and Goliath. And if you've read that book, there's a section in it that talks about civil rights activists of Fred Shuttlesworth and Wyatt Walker and Martin Luther King Jr. working in the South to give students and children involved in civil disobedience and fill the jails against the racist policies of Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, you know that point when you read a book and you get to the page and you get to the bottom and you have no idea what you just read on that page? Well, that happened at about 9 p.m. one night, and I had this daydream, and it was really weird, and I promise I was sober. And if you know the scene from Lion King where Simba's running across the Serengeti chasing Rafiki, and he sees the ghost of Mufasa in the clouds, spoiler alert, Mufasa dies in Lion King. The dream I had was not Mufasa, it was Malcolm Gladwell staring at me from the clouds. And he told me, "You are more than you have become. You must take your place in the circle of life. Remember, remember." And I said, "Malcolm, don't go. I don't know what you mean." And I got to the bottom of the page and then had to reread it of what I was reading about in the first place. But of course I knew what Malcolm meant. He said, "Get your ass off the couch and go do something." So after 2 weeks of hesitation and the help of Malcolm Gladwell's fake ghost, I booked a flight to Washington, D.C. Hundreds of activists had flooded the Capitol, and that morning we were trained in the tactics of civil disobedience and what it meant to risk arrest. We flooded the Capitol and targeted representatives and senators that we thought we could flip their vote, and eventually coalesced in the Capitol Rotunda. And when we were asked to leave, we didn't. When you're arrested in the Capitol Hill, you're taken on a paddy wagon to a separate office where the police officers are. And you know, where athletes kind of like bump their chests in celebration, you can't really do that on a paddy wagon because your hands are tied behind your back. So you have to be a little bit more like subtle. And so as I was meeting the person next to me, we said, you know, like, "How many times have you been arrested?" And this guy's like, 12. I'm like, "Wow, this is my first time." And so to congratulate each other, you have to time it, and you have to count 1, 2, 3, and go. And it's kind of like a modified knuckle bump. We eventually got to the police office, and this is where you're patted down. And this is where you take the position. And in the position where I was, they start at your ankles, and at the point where the police officer's 4 fingers made their way to the intimate valley that was my internal right thigh and my right testicle to ensure that I wasn't hiding anything, I thought, wow, I really have no power over this situation, do I? I now have to ask for permission to go to the bathroom. I have limited control over my body. And the most jarring piece of the experience is that for many of us there in that activist family, there was no choice on risking arrest and civil disobedience. My friend Megan later told me she lives with a neuromuscular disease and lives with a disability. She said, risking arrest and civil disobedience is one of the only ways that I can be heard by my representatives. As a white, cisgendered male living without a disability, it took me 2 weeks to make the decision to risk arrest. And my life is a series of insulations based on my skin color, based on abilities, that I could choose whether or not to get involved. Privilege is a mirror that someone holds up to you, but you don't see your reflection. You see a timeline of all the events that you chose not to act, and were still fine anyways. For many of the activists there, my experience with police officers was a relatively positive one, which is a direct experience of my skin color. For activists of color, that was not the case. In our experiences together, we tried to change this bill. When you leave the police office, you get a piece of paper that says why you were arrested, and I was arrested for incommoding, which sounds a lot like the word commode. And I joke when people ask me, what were you arrested for out in Washington, D.C.? And I said, I took a shit in the United States Capitol hallway and they arrested me. Of course, that didn't happen, but it does provide a really good symbolism for the bill that was being dumped on Americans that day. Thanks. Incommoding is a refusal to move when asked. And we did not move to prevent that bill's passage. A day later at midnight, the bill passed the Senate at 51 votes to 48, and we had lost. But 2017 had offered a series of awakenings. It was a challenge, it was a test, and not just for getting arrested in civil disobedience or risking arrest, but a challenge to act and step forward when called. As we sat in that Capitol Hill rotunda, looking at the ceiling, I couldn't help but notice the symmetry of the circle. And as we sang "This Land Is Your Land," our voices coalesced somewhere up there and came down as one. I hope that with enough of us awakening, that we might move forward and bring truth and validity to those Woody Guthrie words, that this land was made for you and for me. Thank you.